So I'm going to be talking about telecommuting and flexible work schedules, as Erin mentioned. We have had some of these conversations in past seminars and some of our clients individually and directly, just as it relates to pre-COVID and post-COVID normal situations with employees that want to work from home. Of course, this is becoming a larger topic now that we are talking about work from home in a post-COVID era or nearly post-COVID era. So just a little bit of background for you. These statistics were provided by the US Department of Labor in 2019. So we're talking about pre-COVID now. At that point, 23.7% of employed people worked some or all from home. And 41.7% of those that hold an advanced degree worked some or all from home. So what's going to happen in a post-COVID era? We don't know. We expect, of course, that it's going to be a huge influx of requests to work from home, and that there's going to be many more people wanting a more flexible work schedule when it comes to the location of their work. This, of course, has some pros. Reduced overhead, operational costs, real estate. Are you going to be able to reduce your actual real estate footprint and have less office space? We have a lot of clients, including our firm, that are talking about hoteling, where you have less offices available and people share them on a regular basis or on a rotating basis. Less furniture, less overhead generally. It's also a good recruiting tool, offering work-life balance for people that want to work from home. It may also help you hire some non-traditional employees or folks that have stayed out of the workplace for various reasons that now have the ability to work at least part-time or on a more steady basis if they're allowed to do it from home. One of the big impacts that we've seen is having a broader applicant pool. If you are not limited by location and geography, you can post your positions regionally or nationwide, depending on your needs. You could sit here in Portland, Oregon, and have an employee that's working from home in Miami, which then, of course, allows you to take in more applicants. It also helps with things like DEI. Can also take advantage of the potential for lower market rates. Same type of concept. So if you are an employer sitting in Los Angeles, you might be able to hire somebody in Sacramento that works from home and then pay them the market rate for that metropolis instead of the higher market rate in Los Angeles. Of course, we have reduced commuting. That's costs for employees, stress to the extent that employers are paying for parking or any kind of commuting pay. Max passes, that kind of thing. It lowers some of those costs and some of those outcomes. I will say, though, this morning I ran into traffic on the way to work for the first time, so maybe people are coming back into the office. Obviously, increased retention for those people that are enjoying being able to work from home or don't have to step out of the workforce for various reasons related to childcare or other needs that require them to be closer to home. Then they don't have to leave their jobs. There's also societal benefits. I just mentioned traffic, the environment. We've seen that folks working from home and not being in their car so much has had a really positive impact on the environment, and it would be nice if some of that continued. Where there's a pro, there's a con. Some of you may be experiencing some of these pros and cons in your own workplaces, and I'm looking forward to talking about that during our breakout sessions. One of the things we're constantly talking about here in our firm is the con of losing some team dynamics and some mentoring opportunities. A lot of new employees learn by watching. It's easier to drop by your boss's office and have a quick conversation related to a situation, or watch them on a conference call, or for us, attend a hearing, which now that those kind of opportunities just really aren't happening. And so a lot of the mentoring that happens just on the fly on a daily basis is a lot harder to come by when people are working from home. It's harder for somebody, or more disruptive, to send an email or call your cell phone rather than just drop by the office and say, hey, can you show this to me really quick? There's also difficulties with onboarding and training, kind of the same thing. A lot of that has to do with walking people around, introducing them to their colleagues, showing them where things are, how to do things. For me, that meant popping up to IT on a regular basis when I first started at Tonkon, so they could show me how to use the email system. That's harder to do from home. There is, of course, issues of loss of control. trade secrets, confidential information, what's happening over FaceTime, as opposed to in-office meetings and conferences. That is a pretty big issue for a lot of employers. You also have loss of control with regard to wage and hour and making sure that employees are working appropriately, timekeeping challenges, issues of time theft, people recording time that they're not actually working. We'll talk a little bit more about wage and hour stuff in a minute. There's the issue of potential discrimination. This is an important one, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but you want to make sure that you're treating the requirements for eligibility to work from home the same, and that there is not issues related to any of the various protected categories that are going to walk you into trouble in work from home scenarios. Recruiting. I have a friend that works in a tech company, and one of the ways that they get really qualified engineers is because they have a very fun at work environment. They have, the ping pong table, the game day on Thursday afternoons, the beer on tap, and she's having a real trouble recruiting qualified engineers because they're not getting that piece of the environment that sets this company apart. I feel the same about Tonkon. One of the reasons I came here is because I really love my colleagues. And if we're all sitting at home, how do we set ourselves apart, aside from our excellent legal work, to make this the place to be? There's, of course, ADA concerns, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And ADA is disability-related concerns. And then again, social benefits, socializing, the fostering of a cooperative work environment, people helping each other out, getting to know each other, liking each other, being able to brainstorm more easily. I also anticipate that we're going to have some issues with kind of the internet troll concept, whereas when you don't know people as well, or you don't have to face them face to face on a regular basis, how does that affect behavior? Are people going to still be kind to each other in a workplace, or are we going to start seeing a lot more snappy behavior because everything's online or over emails? So if you're going to have a telecommuting policy, what does that look like? Very important to define eligibility up front and the instances in which you're going to allow telecommuting. So are you going to allow it just when there's a pandemic or a natural disaster, inclement weather, or is it going to be on a more regular basis? It should state whether or not which employees are eligible. So that means, full-time employees versus part-time employees, only people in particular departments or in particular workspaces or certain that work under certain managers. Is there any kind of requirement for a introductory period of employment prior to being considered for telecommuting? For example, you must work at the company for 90 days before we'll consider telecommuting. It should also be in writing. You should ask them to make their telecommuting request in writing, and it should be submitted to somebody specific. So think about what we tell you guys all the time with regard to anti-harassment, discrimination, retaliation policies. You don't want ad hoc decisions. And so there should be a specific procedure for approval with somebody that's able to look at it from more of a 10,000 foot view and make sure that the same policies and the same procedures are being applied as they're looking at whether or not somebody's eligible and going to be approved for a telecommuting situation. It should explain the conditions of the arrangement. So for example, a request that's for a trial period, we'll let you try this for 60 days. After that, and at any time, we reserve the right to withdraw it, but we'll give it a shot for 60 days. Should also have the responsibilities and expectations of the job. That means doing the job, of course, but also what does that mean in terms of communication? Is that we expect you to have a call with your supervisor once a week. For managers, is it Zoom meetings with their team on a regular basis? What are the responsibilities and expectations that go with somebody working remotely or at home? We're going to talk about wage and hour policies in a little bit, but it should also designate what the work time is. So is that an 8 to 5 job for a non-exempt employee? Is it 8 to noon for a part-time employee? For an exempt employee, does that mean that they are expected to work whenever the work happens? Safety, we'll talk about workers' comp in a little bit, but essentially making sure that their workplace environment is safe. And then also meal and rest period breaks, which again, we'll talk about in a little bit. You should remind them of all company policies. Again, this should be in writing. So for example, even though you're working from home, our anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, timekeeping policies still apply, which you can find on the internet, or here's a copy to take home with you. If you don't follow company policies and, for example, tell an inappropriate joke on Zoom with your team or over FaceTime, it can still result in discipline and termination of employment or the telecommuting relationship. I do think it's important for a telecommuting policy to include accommodation for disability information. And by that, I just mean mentioning that this is not the space and not the policy that relates to requesting an accommodation. That should be separate. And employees should be very clear on that if they are going to request an accommodation, that is a different, that's a different eligibility requirement and a different process than simply requesting to work from home for other reasons. The policy should also detail what equipment you expect the employee to provide or what equipment you are going to provide for them. Any reimbursement issues, if you hand them a laptop and they break it, what happens? Are you going to pay for them to get internet at their house, faster internet? Are you going to start paying for the telephone? Those kinds of issues should be thought about ahead of time and again applied evenly across employees. And then I always like to have an acknowledgement that they received the policy, that they intend to comply with it. They understand it can be withdrawn at any time and for any reason, and a signature from the employee. Okay, I forecasted this a little bit earlier, but as always in an L&E presentation, issues of discrimination should be top of mind. We just went over eligibility requirements for a telecommuting policy and how they should be objective. I can't stress that enough, especially in a world now where a lot of people are going to be asking to work from home for a variety of different reasons. We just need to make sure that we're being very clear regarding what those eligibility requirements are and somewhat unwavering. If you're going to say that it's for full-time employees, make it for full-time employees unless it's an accommodation need. Otherwise, you start applying these rules ad hoc and you may not even realize some of the patterns that you're getting into as a company that then result in undesirable outcomes. So policy should be neutral, as well as the application of the policy. For example, this is an easy example. If somebody wants to work from home as a result of parenting needs, we need to allow dads, moms, adoptive parents, partners to take advantage of those same rules. Unless there is some sort of disability need that is complicating it, for example, physical needs of a new mother, then dads and moms get the same parenting rights if you're going to decide that work from home is going to be a policy that benefits parents that need to be home. For example, kids being home from school as a result of COVID. Gender, same thing. Age, one thing to be careful about here is any assumptions that you're making about individuals' ability to work from home, either because they're older or younger. So for example, newer employee being required to be at the office in order to be mentored and to have more face time with their supervisor, fine. Younger employee, not okay. Sometimes those things go hand in hand, sometimes they don't, but we need to be very careful about the reasons that we're doing it, i.e. for mentoring, not because you think somebody's young and immature and can't work from home. Same thing about age for older workers. Don't make the assumption that they can't use the technology at home. If they can use the technology and they can work from home, fine. If the concern is about technology, don't make it about age. Make it about the ability to log on to Zoom meetings, use all of the facilities that you need them to in order to be successful at home. And of course, we've talked about disability a few times more, or a few times already. We'll do it a few times more. And as Lorena and everybody else has said, in every presentation we've ever had, appropriate documentation is key. If you're going to either approve it or decline it, and in particular, if you're going to decline it, the reasons for that should be documented. Okay, telecommuting and the ADA. Once again, we're talking about disability accommodations. We expect to see a huge spike in requests to work from home as a reasonable accommodation. We have always handled these issues. We have always had employees asking to work from home. And generally speaking, in the past, the response has been, that's not reasonable. Well, now we've had people home for over a year for the most part, and it's going to be harder to say that that's not a reasonable accommodation because we've seen it work when it was for the benefit of the employer. And so it likewise should work when it's for the benefit of the employee. So these questions need to be more carefully thought through in a post-COVID era. First, identify the essential job functions. You've heard us say this before. If the essential job functions is being in the warehouse in order to drive the forklift, say so. That's not something that can be done from home. If it is to run in-person sales pitches, something like that may not be able to work well from home. Really think through what those essential job functions are and whether or not that requires at the office presence on a regular basis, or if it can be sporadic or never. That really needs to be something that we're thinking about proactively. Considering the limitations of the employee that's requesting the time off or the work from home availability and their workplace needs. So we just talked about, for example, mentoring. That might be a reason why you would prefer to do a reasonable accommodation that allows the employee to come into the office as opposed to working from home. That's going to be really specific to the employee and really fact specific to the job, but think about that as you're thinking about whether or not it's a reasonable accommodation. Again, assess whether some of it can be performed at home, all of it. Can you grant it on a limited basis? Can they always work from home? Does once a month work? And how does that all jive with the doctor's note that provided a need for a disability accommodation? You may have to modify equipment or technology. For example, get a screen reader for somebody that's having difficulty with their eyes, a ergonomic office chair for the home office, different keyboard, dual monitors. Those are all things to think about, and they may be required if you're going to let somebody work from home for disability reasons. A last note, we talk about this all the time, but reasonable does not mean the most desired. If there are a number of different accommodations that would work for the employee, one of which is work from home, but there's something else you can do at the office that works just as well and is also a reasonable accommodation, you can choose that as the accommodation. Just tread carefully. A final note on this, we have almost always said in the past that when somebody wants to work from home and we don't think that that's a reasonable accommodation, it's because we need more personal contact. There's meetings, there's team synergy. Some of that is going to fall by the wayside as a reason. So be really careful when you do that. Like I said, it's been working for employers for the last year to have Zoom meetings, phone calls, FaceTime. To the extent that that still works, even if it's not your favorite, we need to be very careful about declining an ADA accommodation based on those reasons. Also interesting is the ADA when it comes to websites, software, and other online mechanisms. Parna, who you'll hear from later, and I have had a number of cases actually related to the ADA and websites. This is a new case du jour all over the country. But the long and the short of it is if you're going to have people apply online, it needs to be ADA accessible. That includes captions, screen reading software. There are web content accessibility guidelines that you can follow. Make sure your vendor or your IT people are aware of them and that you're making your websites accessible to employees or potential employees that are not physically present in the office. If you're going to have them apply online, you need to have an alternative means, such as a print and write it out and mail it in or drop it off. If you are going to have an intranet that is now providing all of the policies or postings that would ordinarily be in your workplace, think about how that works with the web contact guidelines to make sure that every employee has access and can see those policies and can see those posters just as they would as if they were in the office. For a lot of workplace environments, this won't actually be too much of an issue in terms of your particular employment population, but it is something to be thinking about and staying on top of. You may need some sort of screen reading software built into your websites. Hiring, same sort of issues. If you're going to have people applying across the country and working from home, you want to make sure they have access to all of your policies, like I just discussed, and you want to make sure that you're enforcing them. So we talked about the off-color joke on a Zoom meeting. That needs to be disciplined in the same way as if it happened in a conference room at your office. Same thing goes with training, making sure that individuals that are sitting at home somewhere else are receiving the same caliber and the same type of training as everybody else if you're going to hold them to the same standards. A small reminder on electronic signatures, to the extent that you are doing any kind of signing of policies, signing of training, signing of employment applications, offer letters, anything like that online. There are laws that apply. E-sign is one of them. There are state specific laws as well that essentially require the employee or the person that signed, the other signatory, to consent to an online signature and having the same force and effect as a wet ink signature. So just make sure you're following those. You've probably all seen it with like a DocuSign. It'll have you check the box saying that, yes, you're consenting to your signature having the same force and effect. And there are specific laws about that. So to the extent you're going to be doing a lot of stuff online, make sure that you are having somebody take a look to make sure you're compliant with e-sign laws. Practical matter introduction to supervisors and team members, obviously more difficult if you are spread out over the country or everybody's working from home. This goes to some of that soft skill stuff, and every work environment is different. But you do want to make sure that people that are at home understand who they're working with and know who to reach out to in the event that they need something. Performance feedback goals and metrics is interesting to think about. You may have to adjust some of these goals when you're thinking about people working from home. How does it look in terms of a successful employee? Does that mean that they are constantly available? They're very responsive over emails or over phone. They're talking to their supervisors in the mean and the mode that the supervisor requests, whether that's email, phone, text, Zoom meetings. Are they managing people effectively? Some of these things are maybe a little bit different than if somebody's in the office, and you might want to build some of that into your performance management systems. Wage and hour issues are a huge one for employees that are working from home. Most of you know that the law says time is compensable if you, quote, suffer or permit the employee to work. I always think it's funny that the law actually writes suffer and work in the same place, but I'll set that aside for a moment. That means that if you know an employee is working or you don't stop them from working, you owe them for that time. It's pretty much that simple. It's not just I asked you to work or I didn't ask you to work. If they are working, you know about it and you don't stop it, you owe them. So you have to compensate employees for all hours that they work, whether they're at home or remote. Clearly being at home when you can't see them, they're not leaving the office is more of a challenge for timekeeping. Have very clear policies about that. That you can refer to. Again, I love attestations. I love people signing policies showing that they received it. For non-exempt employees in particular, you want to set clear guidelines about performing additional work from home. If they are supposed to work 8 to 5 and they get an email at 5:30, they should understand whether or not they're allowed to respond to it or it is something to respond to the next day. Those lines get really blurred. Clear records about timekeeping is always going to be important. The burden is on the employer to prove that the time was worked or not worked. And so the better your records, the better off you're going to be. Cell phone use is a huge problem from remote employees, particularly if they're getting calls on their cell phones, they're getting text messages after hours, there's voicemails to respond to. Again, all of that is compensable time. And if you're allowing employees to respond to text messages at 9 o'clock at night, you have to pay them for that. And of course, management of that time and discipline when somebody is violating the rules is very important. It goes back to that concept of suffer, permit. If you're going to permit them to do it, you're going to owe them the time. If you've told them you only work from 8 to 5 and they're responding to text messages at 5:30, then you do want to make very clear that that's not okay and put an end to it. You still have to pay for the time, but that's going to help you later if they ever claim that they worked all this overtime that they didn't record, that you were keeping an eye on it and disciplining work after hours. And so anything after that really is more like time theft. I also like attestations on timesheets. So when an employee turns in their time at the end of the week, they say, I certify that all of the time recorded on my timesheet is true and accurate. I didn't work off the clock. I took all of my legally required meal and rest breaks, and then they sign it. That really helps us proof later that you paid them appropriately. Data security and monitoring is, of course, a very important aspect of workplace security for employees that are working from home. Data breaches and the like are going to be more difficult, or I guess are going to happen more often when employees are at home. Again, clear policies, you've heard me say it 10 times, that's always going to be key. Some of those policies with data security might say things like, don't download any third-party software. Your laptop is not to leave your home office. For example, you don't want an employee working at Starbucks logging onto their unsecure Wi-Fi network and then leaving it on the table when they go to use the restroom and having it stolen with all of your company data on it. So where are they allowed to work? How are they allowed to work? And what to do in the event that they do lose a password or have their laptop or iPhone or whatever it is stolen. Acceptable uses of company devices, again, should my child be playing Minecraft with strangers on my company laptop? Is that okay? Is our data security enough that that's not really going to matter at all? Or do we want to make sure that these things are locked down for company use only? With my kids, I would say I probably shouldn't let them. Consider monitoring usage, again, running in the background as far as employees being logged in and what they're actually doing to make sure that you're taking care of both timekeeping issues, time theft issues, and also employee productivity. Some people hate this. It feels very much Big Brother, but when you have employees working from home, you may want to consider it. Same thing with logging in and logging out. When did they end their day? That way you know for certain. Restricting printing, websites and screen grabs. I think that this is important. I do a lot of trade secret litigation. I can't tell you how many employees have landed themselves in trouble because they work from home totally appropriately and printed a bunch of stuff in the course and scope of their job and then decided to leave to go to another employer and didn't think about that file cabinet they had with all of the confidential and trade secret information sitting in their office. So just something to think about, particularly with your highly sensitive data, employee files, for example, that you may have access to, the medical files we talked about earlier. And then also thinking about requiring additional security or authentication to get into the system. So for example, with our firm, you have to both log on the computer and then go through an extra security login on your phone. So if somebody stole my laptop, it's useless to them because they have to also hit the green check on the phone to make sure it's the right person. Think about building some of that stuff in. Okay, very quickly, other considerations. OSHA, you need to be reporting anything to OSHA that you would otherwise have to report within the work environment to workers that are at home. Workers' compensation does apply to home offices. So if somebody gets injured walking around their desk in their very crowded office on their kitchen table, you may end up having to file a workers' comp claim for that. Taxes, whether that's employee taxes, writing off business expenses, making sure that's consistent with what you're telling them about reimbursement. Also, if you are going to have employees sitting elsewhere and not in your office, you have to think about business registration and paying taxes of that state. So in my earlier example, an employee sitting in Florida, while you're here in Oregon, now you might have to register your business in Florida to pay that employee appropriately. Choice of law is going to be important, making sure that your agreements, any employment agreements or other documents have an appropriate choice of law for Oregon or wherever else if you have employees all over the place. And then just paying attention to reimbursement, which varies by state. Like in California, you have to reimburse for everything. So making sure you're abreast of those laws before you allow people to work from home. Okay, I think I'm over as usual. Went a little bit too long, but now I'm going to kick you over to everybody's best friend, Bob. I don't know what Bob's talking about, but I'm sure he'll tell you. Thanks, everybody.